Hello, I'm Selena Weigel Elias Varga. This is Social Work 501 at Widener University, and I'm doing a timeline presentation. We're talking about Debbie's Midlife Awakening and the Peacock Effect. From Erikson's lens of stage 7, developmental stage 7, generativity and stagnation, in paraphrase, to build a greater society and to contribute to the journey to expand one's horizons or to stay put and rest upon the laurels of a life created? Who knows? Relationships have been formed, a self-created nuclear family may be established, careers have been established, and may be reevaluated. All the factors necessary for survival have been generally resolved, and now life begs the question, what more is there? And in this presentation, I would like to propose that Debbie answered that question, what more is there, with joy, courage, strength, and abandon as she stepped into what she self-identifies as the Peacock Effect, and her 40th birthday being her Peacock year. So a bit more about midlife. Often the concept of a midlife crisis comes up when we hear the word midlife, and we think about a 50-year-old man with his white or red Corvette and a young girlfriend, often changing careers, often doing something drastic in personal image change, like a tattoo or a wild haircut or a piercing, or some other change to signify that this is a time of shift and a time of transition. Well, in the 1970s, a fantastic author by the name of Gail Sheehy published the work Passages, and this was a general book available for the general populace, not necessarily a peer-reviewed or text or something from the field of psychotherapy, so she got a lot of harsh criticism. Psychotherapists, psychologists, and I believe also a psychologist, Levinson, Valiant, and Gould, all three of them counterbalanced her, and one after the other published texts, published peer-reviewed journals and articles, creating their own version of the midlife. But in Sheehy's passages, she describes midlife as a crisis for men, but a time of awakening for women. And this blew my mind as I was reading this. And so I want to quote from Schmidt's article, The Anti-Feminist Reconstruction of the Midlife Crisis, where she talks about this work and this experience. So drawing on the language of the women's movement and on the feminist science, Gail Sheehy, presented a concept that challenged separate roles and encouraged women's liberation. Levinson, Valiant, and Gould responded with a male-centered definition of midlife crisis that stigmatized criticism of gender hierarchies as man-hating and barred women from changing their lives. The notion of popularization did important work in making this dominant meaning of midlife crisis. So when the word first really came on the scene in popular media and popular culture, midlife crisis wasn't a crisis at all. It was a crisis for men because women were stepping out of the homes, they were developing careers. Now that their children are older and more independent, women were suddenly able to attend classes, step into the work field, become independent, and put on the pants, as the saying may go, and in turn their male partners, in a heteronormative assumption of marriage and life partnering, which is a problematic in Erikson's theories, but we'll get back to that. This became a crisis for their male partners because suddenly the structure of the little wife staying home, taking care of the kids, and preparing the meal no longer existed, and they became disillusioned and had to find their own identity outside of the identity formed by the efforts of their wives and the women in their lives. So influential moments for Debbie during her developmental stage and during her midlife awakening, she had a very dear friend, Glenda, who she and Debbie shared their birth date and both turned 40 at a jazz festival in St. Lucia, of which Glenda had won tickets. And this was a moment where Glenda just called up and said, "Hey, I have tickets, let's go." And Debbie said, you know what, it's my birthday, it's your birthday, let's do this. Well, this is a really pivotal moment. Not only was Debbie stepping out to have a big adventure away from her marriage, away from her responsibilities as a mother, but it was also a place where she met a man by the name of Maurice and began what grew into a long-term love affair, and was a love that validated her. And she describes feeling smitten, and she describes being loved for exactly who she was in a way that she had never been loved before, in a way that did not exist in her marriage. With Maurice also came a job opportunity, and she worked for him importing goods to St. Lucia from the US for quite some time. And 2 years later, she was doing so well that she decided to launch out on her own, checked in with Maurice, he gave her his blessing, and she continued and she launched as a self-employed woman. And in that time, she had only a high school education, and this was before the internet, and this is a product finding job, so she took her wits with her to the library and did her own research and really put in the elbow grease to make her business successful and to be a successful international female entrepreneur. 10 years later, or 8 years later from starting her business, at the age of 50, and after 25 years of being in an emotionally abusive relationship that began primarily because of pregnancy early on in the relationship, their relationship did end in divorce. And from that, she became what she describes as the new and improved Debbie, and stepped further into her peacock identity, allowing her bright feathers to shine and her bold beautifulness to be bigger and bolder. Developmental stages, challenges, and accomplishments. The challenges she really faced in this transition, in this stage 7 transition, was being in an emotionally abusive relationship and the effects that that can have on a person's identity and a person's ability to step out for themselves. And also navigating a business with limited resources. As mentioned before, she had only a high school education, and at that time, the resources to do what she needed to do were limited and something she had to self-create. So she really had only her wit and tenacity, and also a solid social network. So her accomplishments were gaining independence as a single and self-made woman at the age of 40, at the age of 50, and continuing. And at the age of 65, she remains a single and self-made woman. And this opened relationships with multiple retailers and created a business that lasted 20 years. And she did, at the age of 65 now, she says she has friends around the world. A huge accomplishment for anyone. The psychosocial challenge factor that she faced at the age of 40, she was stepping outside of socially and culturally supported status of marriage. In our society still, divorce is not necessarily a positive thing, and a lot of effort is put into staying in marriage. So she stepped outside of that and was identifying as a self-employed woman with only a high school education, engaging in international exchange. Some psychosocial factors of support that existed. Her transition into her midlife awakening was aided by a strong and ever-growing social network of friends and family. Her mother was an established member of a religious community that came with its own network and support system. Her daughter, who had become a teenager at that point and progressively an emerging adult, was incredibly supportive of her mother being independent, her mother being a business owner, her mother divorcing, and now her daughter, as a grown adult, is also a self-made, self-employed powerhouse of a woman. At 40 years old, she met someone who showed her what it was like to be loved for exactly who she was, and seen as beautiful and seen as the powerhouse that she is. And her strong, positive outlook on life and belief systems rooted in there always being something good around the corner, keeping her going through tough times. And more about that belief system, at a very young age, she coined the expression, "you know what you know," and it kept her going. Despite her lack of advanced education, she knew where information was, went straight to the library and hit the books and learned what she needed to know as each project and each contract required more and more knowledge. She got that knowledge, however she knew how. If she needed help, she knew who to reach out to, and coincidence and circumstance and a little bit of effort and luck kept her going. So the crisis of the midlife crisis, or the midlife awakening, resolved in an environment when middle-aged women were depicted as saintly and asexual mothers. In Suzanne Schmidt's article, The Anti-Feminist Reconstruction of the Midlife Crisis, nope, that's the wrong article. From Weitz's article, analyzing films through the 1930s to the 1970s and depictions of women and sexuality, Weitz writes that women were depicted as saintly and asexual. In a survey of films in the mid-90s, she found of a decade of award-winning films, it boiled down to only 13 films having lead roles of women over the age of 45 who were seen as sexually active. And even in those 13 films, many of the films depicted a male lens on that sexuality, or did not show scenes of sexuality, but instead hinted at them, perpetuating this notion that women in middle age aren't necessarily sexual beings. Well, Debbie broke that mold and dove into what she describes as a cinematic life, saying yes to her sexual energy, saying yes to her ability to make connections around the world and run a successful mission business, and saying yes to her life. Turning what could have been a crisis into an awakening. In contribution to Peck's theory, in contribution to Erikson's theory, we also have Peck's theory of the second half of life. So Peck proposed that midlife, as we refer to it, comes with 4 adjustments to be made: valuing wisdom over physical powers, socializing versus sexualizing, emotional flexibility versus emotional impoverishment, mental flexibility versus mental rigidity. In the context of Debbie's story in life, going from 1 to 4, valuing wisdom over physical powers, she stepped out of the physical efforts of being a wife and being a mother and into the intellectual efforts of researching, providing, connecting, and getting needs met through social networking rather than heavy lifting and hard work. Socializing and sexualizing, she broke the mold on this one. She stepped deeper into her sexual energy and used that as a further drive and a further tool of strengthening her social connections, while Peck theorizes that we step out of connecting for the purpose of sexual satisfaction and step into connecting for the purpose of building a network. I would say Debbie did a little bit of both. With emotional flexibility versus emotional impoverishment, she could have very well stayed mired in an emotionally abusive relationship, and yet she chose to step out and to apply flexibility, and in section 4, apply mental flexibility rather than rigidity, and allowed herself to roll with the punches and know what she knows and keep on going and continuing into an awakened midlife rather than a crisis. So Smith, Gaucho, and Flaws published in their article Factors Affecting Sexual Function of Midlife Women stated that women between age 45 and 54 with a self-perceived higher quality of life reported more frequent sexual activity. And they were analyzing the Midlife Women's Health Study, a rather extensive study, and in their interpretations of this, what they found was contradictory to what media was saying, as general media and general population were saying that midlife women were asexual. What Smith, Gaucho, and Flaws pointed out in the Midlife Women's Health Study is, in fact, if middle-aged women are happy, they're sexually active. And Debbie definitely proved that, and this is one more flaw in Peck's theory.